Yesterday I went through the book of Daniel, and I did a lot of the, well, not a lot, but a significant amount of analysis as I went along. But today I want to do more of the analysis part. There's no need to go over the text again unless you want to, and you can find that easily online just about anywhere. I use BibleGateway.com, and there's Blue Letter Bible, all sorts of things. But the analysis is at one of my blogs, and this is actually not a blog, my book site, and the link's in the description. And it starts off with some of the things I mentioned the other day, so I'll just kind of go through that, and then we'll get into matching it up, what Daniel said, to the brief references I made yesterday to what Jesus said in the Gospels. So Daniel, as I think I mentioned yesterday, is pretty much the linchpin of Bible prophecy. It's not the only book, but it's probably one of the most significant ones because it gives additional context to Revelation and to many of the other scattered smaller prophecies, and not to mention Ezekiel being small, but it's lesser known, as is, say, Psalm 83, Isaiah 17, and some other things. Excuse me. And I'm going to, like I said, just read through this briefly and then get to that part in Matthew, because there's some interesting points to make. Daniel's, among other things, its biggest plus is its sequence. Revelation is mostly sequential. It's got 3 sets of 7 judgments. But even there, we have some parentheses or a third dimension to the thing, if you want to call it that, where, say, for example, the middle chapters of Revelation, by process of elimination, they refer back to things that had started at the beginning. And so, I've been over that, and they've recommended some videos on it. Anyway, I'm looking mostly at Daniel again, as you can see from the title and yesterday's discussion. And let me get that started here. Saying hi to people in the chat. Ironically enough, we have a Daniel in the chat, and that's special. Anyway, I mentioned before about what an abomination is in prophecy, and that's that an idol is set up in a holy place that belongs to another god, and you can check Ezekiel 8 for an example of that. Its purpose is to defile the other god's temple, and we saw that in Daniel 9:27, and there's some other references there. And for more reference, you can look at some of the apocryphal books that are between the Testaments, also having to do with desecrating a temple. Antiochus Epiphanes, the one I mentioned yesterday, he died in 164 BC, is the only historical figure to deliberately fill the temple with unclean things, especially, as I mentioned yesterday, the statue of Zeus with his own face on it. Let's check the footnote here. The name Antiochus Epiphanes can be roughly translated as the illustrious one who supports against or opposes. And there's a link there for where I got that. And it's basically an early meaning of Antichrist. So aptly named. And then he went on to fulfill Daniel's prophecy of the abomination. But, as I mentioned yesterday, Jesus, long after this, still spoke of the abomination as referring to a yet future event. And Paul called him the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians 2, that this person would enter the temple and declare himself God at a future time. So that is desecration, and it will happen again, just as Jesus said. So in Revelation 13:14, we're also told that there will be an image or idol made, which everyone on earth will be forced to worship. But it doesn't say it's going to be put into the temple in that location, but we can put that together from all the other references. And this is a principle that a lot of people call now but not yet fulfillment. That is, they're fulfilled partially at one time, but more completely at another time. So the question is whether Daniel's prophecy was completely fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. And to be completely fulfilled, it would have to fulfill every detail, which not even Antiochus Epiphanes did. So it did leave the door open, in spite of having a lot of fulfillments. And I think the mistake a lot of prophecy students make is only taking a percentage and saying, well, if I've got 2 or 3 things that line up, then that's good, and we're done with that prophecy. And that's not really a complete view, I don't think, because we can see over and over again in hindsight how the Bible does these things, and that God often has more than one fulfillment of a prophecy. Now let's look at what Jesus said in the 3 of the Gospels that mentions these same events. That's being Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the so-called synoptic Gospels, because they basically cover the same ground from different angles for different audiences. And John, the Gospel of John, is more anecdotal, more personal side of things. And John is just kind of, out there as a writer. He's very otherworldly. And so he's usually not included in what I mentioned, the word synoptic Gospels. But Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 all cover the same speech by Jesus when he was asked by his disciples about things to come, because Jesus had been walking through the temple compound with his disciples, and they were pointing out the magnificent buildings, and Jesus said, basically, appreciate them while they're here, because the time will come when not one stone will be left upon another. And this was what he said publicly, and he said a few other things, and then privately he told them more. And I've gone over that in one of my other prophecy documents. I may try to bring that up later, but what we can see here is a lot of parallel. The one in Matthew starts with a statement that is not repeated in the other 2. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And that, of course, is a sequence, again, not necessarily a timing. That is to say, the end doesn't necessarily commence the minute everybody in the world has heard the gospel. That's not what, there's often gaps. It's like someone has described Bible prophecy as like someone, like the prophet looking across a row of mountain peaks and seeing the sequence, but not the valleys between them. And the, distances become compressed the farther you can see. That's, like a zoom lens would do. It compresses the distance. And so this is a good illustration of prophecy because, excuse me, often you can see just the important points, and that's what God gives you, but he doesn't tell you how much time lapses between them. And so the rest of what Jesus says in Matthew 24 there lines up with the other 3. And I'm trying to just scroll a little bit so we can try to see all those on the screen at one time. I think I've got them. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation as declared through the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, that's the first statement. He repeats that in Mark, and he does not repeat it in Luke. Okay? So there's 2 things. There's a little overlap among them. The first one was about the gospel being preached. That's not repeated in the others. This statement about the abomination of desolation is repeated in Mark, but not in Luke, but of course not in John, which isn't even in the picture here right now. Then he says, so the first event in the sequence is the abomination of desolation. Then those in Judea must run away into the mountains, okay? Pay attention to who's running and where they're going. And this is repeated in Mark. But Luke is different. Luke says, instead of the abomination of desolation, it says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by military encampments, know that its ruin is near. Then those in Judea must run away to the mountains. Okay? So there's a little element of 2 different fulfillments going on here, in my opinion. And in hindsight, we can see that, yes, the area of the city of Jerusalem was surrounded by the armies of Titus in 70 AD, and they laid siege to it. And the Christians were the only one. If you look, I have some footnotes here. I'll go into that more. They were the ones who ran. The Jews didn't. But it doesn't say specifically Jews. It says those in Judea must run away to the mountains. All 3 of them have that. Those in Judea must run away to the mountains. Okay? After that, sometime after, there will be great oppression, or the people usually know it by its King James Middle English term, Great Tribulation. That's what tribulation is translated from a Greek word that means to be oppressed, or persecution, we might say, or suffering. So that's the next thing in the sequence after the surrounding of Jerusalem and the abomination of desolation. So we have the Great Tribulation, and this is in all three of them. So Matthew says, great oppression, the likes of which should never happen from the beginning of the world until now, nor will ever happen again. In fact, if those days had not been cut short, all flesh would have been wiped out, but they would be shortened for the sake of the chosen people. Mark puts it a little different, but it's the same thing. You know, it's pretty obvious. Nothing like it has ever happened before, will ever happen again, and the days would be cut short for the sake of the chosen ones. And then Luke, and that's where the other two end as far as what they say about it. Luke says about, terrible stress and great rage against this people. Who is this people? The Jews. So everybody in the world is going to hate the Jews. That's already been going on. They will be killed in battle and taken captive to all the other nations. Then Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until their time is up. This statement is worded in such a way that seems to indicate the intervening history between 70 AD and the present time. But the great rage on the people has really never stopped. But like I said, it's not mentioned in the other two. Anyway, the tie-in with the other two, with Luke here with Matthew and Mark, is the terrible stress. But this added detail is about specifically against the Jews, and that the Jews would be killed in battle, 70 AD, and taken away captive to other nations. That's what happened in history. And Jerusalem had been trampled by the Gentiles all this time, and the time is really not yet up, because the capital city is still got a lot of non-Jews in it, and they still don't have their temple, their holy place. And then, more detail in Luke that is not in the other two, then there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. Signs. That doesn't mean the events happen at the time of the sign. Signs almost always precede what they're pointing to. And there are some signs, as I've gone over in other videos and documents, that are before and after. Anyway, this is the sequence. So we have after the times of the Gentiles. And remember this running to the mountains, because, as I'll show in a footnote, it wasn't the mountains to which people ran in 70 AD. Anyway, we have this, after the things that are kind of variable, we have the terrible pressure against Jerusalem, and then the sun's, moon, and stars signs. And on the earth, the nations will be filled with anguish and perplexity due to the roaring and turbulence of the sea. People will be deathly afraid and apprehensive of what is coming upon the whole world, for the forces of the heavens will be shaken. So here is clearly in Luke more detail about the end times that have not happened in history. I just saw in chat, running to the mountains meaning to pray. I'm pretty sure by the context that, when the Bible says for people to pray, it says pray. Running to the mountains is something that seems to me, at least, and to a lot of other people, to be a literal take off and go. And Jesus will elaborate on that when he says, if you read the passages about fleeing from the area of Judea, he says, when you see the abomination and desolation, then you have to, if you're up on the roof of your house, don't even go inside to get anything. Don't go, if you're out in the field, don't go back to your house to grab your coat. Just take off and run. And that doesn't, I'm kind of thinking that doesn't match up with meaning just to pray. I mean, we were supposed to pray all the time as Christians. But again, Jesus is talking before the cross, before there was any entity called the church, and before anybody knew it was coming. And so he's talking to the Jews about the Jews, and that's what Daniel was all about too. At any rate, Jesus said that the people of earth will be filled with anguish because of the sea. And I don't think this is an ordinary tsunami. This is like if you had a bowl of water and you shook it. And think of that on a Earth-size scale, where the oceans are being shaken to the point where you would have the most, not only a tsunami that would come over the land, but it would go back and forth and back and forth. And there's an Old Testament prophecy that talks about the earth reeling like a drunkard. And so this is what Jesus is referring to in Luke 21, and is talking about a time that has not happened yet. And then sequence again, not immediately following one after the other. We don't know the time between them, but the sequence is after this event, then people will see the human, or the Son of Man, Jesus, coming in a cloud with great power and majesty. And then Jesus says, when you, who's he talking to? The Jews who have survived the tribulation, when you see all of this coming to pass, stand up and raise your heads, for you're about to be rescued. In other words, not to be afraid. This is your Messiah. He's coming to save you at last. Hi, once again. Let me stop here for a second. In the chat, yeah, we were talking about Daniel yesterday. I read through the book and I made a lot of comments about various things and what the visions and prophecies meant, because Daniel is a very key prophetic book. And so you might want to watch that sometime. It went for 2 hours. And this one, I'm mostly just going over some more analysis of the book. Anyway, what I wanted to do is also, I made mention yesterday of how Daniel ties into other parts of the Bible. And here we have the tie-ins to the Gospels where Jesus was talking. And I had just mentioned how we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke talking about the same speech basically Jesus gave, and there's differences and overlaps between the three accounts. And Luke has the more future to our time yet account than the other two. But he does say in Luke about seems to me to refer to the intervening time between when Jerusalem was ransacked in 70 AD by Roman army led by Titus, and the present time. So I don't want to go over all that again, but this is how we analyze what things have happened and what haven't. Okay, so history shows that the people of Judea were scattered among the Gentiles and that Jerusalem has been trampled by them through that time and even today. And there have been many wars and natural disasters the last couple thousand years, not quite 2,000, but here's the exceptions. And what I said earlier about, in order to say whether a prophecy was completely fulfilled, it has to have hit every detail. And here we're going to see the details that have not been covered yet. So I asked, did anyone desecrate the temple in 70 AD? Though it was burned and dismantled by the armies of Titus, he did not set up any idol in it. Neither did he take his place in the temple and proclaim himself God. And then I give some references where those are required fulfillments. And the next question, did the people of Judea flee to the mountains when they saw Jerusalem surrounded? There's no indisputable record of any mass exodus at that time to the mountains. And here I have a footnote. We'll go check that. The city of Pella, where many Christians are thought to have fled before the siege, because they were reading the scriptures and paying attention to what Jesus said. The Jews were not. This is at a fairly low altitude, and you can find out its elevation here. But that's where the Christians went. The Jews didn't run. So there's differences. There's things that didn't happen. In fact, the Roman armies allowed people into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, but refused to let them leave in order to put a great strain on their resources and supplies during the siege. And there's a footnote. You can read all about the siege of Jerusalem. Another question, was the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple sudden? Because the Bible talks about sudden destruction in those references, and clearly not. There were events leading up to the final siege, and they didn't happen in a day. And again, there's a reference. You can read up on that. Next question, did Nero, whom some identify as the final fulfillment of the prophecies of both Daniel and Revelation, did he die as specified in these references? No, he committed suicide. He was not killed in battle. And we have a footnote for that, so you can read up on it. And neither did he or any of his associates cause everyone in the world, even if limited to the Roman Empire, to take a mark on their forehead or right hand and forbid commerce without it. Some people would say he couldn't have, but here again, that's beside the point. The point is that Nero did not fulfill the prophecy, because there are a lot of people, preterists especially, or some historicists, who think that Nero was the Antichrist and that all that stuff has happened. But clearly he didn't meet all the criteria. So it wasn't, even if it was a partial fulfillment, then it wasn't a complete one, and another Antichrist still remains. Another question is, did Jesus return in the clouds accompanied by all the signs in the sky and set up his visible earthly kingdom for 1,000 years. And this should have happened at or very shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, if that was the complete fulfillment. But the only way to claim that happened is to completely spiritualize it, which is inconsistent at best, because people who take the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and the abomination of desolation as literal and physical can't turn around in that same context and claim that Jesus' return was not physical and literal. So they can't have it both ways, yet they do. They want to say that, well, you know, these things were literal fulfillments, but Jesus coming back in the clouds is some euphemism or whatnot. And I think that's, as I said, inconsistent at best. I think it's dishonest and disingenuous. So I think that preterism falls on like a gazillion different reasons, but that's one of them. So as kind of a summary of all that, I say that some aspects of the prophecy were fulfilled in 70 AD and some in the ensuing centuries. Other important details have yet to occur, and we can't presume that only the unfulfilled parts remain, since we've already seen that Jesus put events such as the abomination in the future, in spite of it having been fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes in the past. So we can have partial fulfillments, but it's not done with until it's completely fulfilled. So the extent of remaining prophecies of Daniel and Revelation is anyone's guess, because fulfillment is sometimes in the eye of the beholder. But we should also note that the abomination and fleeing Jerusalem is also seen in Revelation 12 and 13. So if you look there in those passages, and I've done a detailed study on those video series, you can see that middle section of Revelation is also where the abomination happens and the Antichrist reveals himself claiming to be God. That is the signal, the unmistakable signal for people living in Judea to take off. Okay? And so we match that to Revelation there. So there's where Daniel and Revelation tie together in unmistakable terms. And that is identified by Daniel as the midpoint of a 7-year treaty. So 3.5 years before this abomination, there had to have been a 7-year treaty set up, and that when the people of Jerusalem or the area of Judea see this, and this is not the church, once again, has nothing to do with the church, when they see this happen, they are to run, get out of Jerusalem, because as shown in other passages or other books in the Old Testament, let alone Revelation, that Jerusalem is about to be ransacked, and they don't want to be there for that. So, as I mentioned yesterday, though, there are a lot of parts of Daniel that have had fulfillment, and we've gone over all those chapters yesterday. And the uncanny accuracy, as I mentioned before, of Daniel is why so many people who hate the Bible or don't believe in miracles and don't believe in prophecy tried to post-date it, because they couldn't believe anybody could know these things ahead of time. And yet I think a lot of other people are convinced that their efforts to do so have failed miserably, and Daniel was written before the fact. So this is another point of legitimacy for the Bible telling the truth all the time, and so we can trust it for things that haven't happened yet. So we have to be careful as well, and I saw this in some charts I was trying to look up to show in a little bit, where they mistakenly apply things to the future that have been completely fulfilled in the past. So we have to be careful about this and not be sloppy. And then here was a brief, once again, just to review yesterday's thing just a little bit more. Chapter 2 of Daniel was when Nebuchadnezzar, the first king of Babylon, well, maybe not the first king, the great king of Babylon, had that dream about the statue with the head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, lower legs of iron, and feet of a mixture of iron and clay. And we'll see more about that in the chart I'm going to show. Daniel identified the head as Nebuchadnezzar. After him would follow a lesser kingdom. Now, yesterday, I think I might have been a little confusing, think of putting Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar, as the next section of the statue, but that's not it. I hope I didn't give that impression, because it's still the kingdom of Babylon. And this next section of the image of the statue is the king of the Medes and Persians. So I hope I didn't confuse anybody about that. But then that's the lesser kingdom, Medo-Persian kingdom ruled by Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian, I mentioned yesterday. Then the Grecian Empire ruled by Alexander the Great, and finally one that would smash all others, and that would be Rome. And of course, we read yesterday about the 4 generals of Alexander, and I'll get into that in a second. Chapter 8 was the vision of the goat and the ram, and these were the kings of Media and Persia. It also, in chapter 8, describes the conquest of Alexander the Great, after whose death 4 of his generals would rule. And however you pronounce these, Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And we've heard of those kingdoms, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, etc. And these were his 4 generals rather than his own sons, which Daniel predicted, that this person would rise up and then his kingdom would be short-lived and it would not pass to his children, it would pass to his generals. And the little horn in chapter 8 of Daniel, coming later, was none other than the vile Antiochus Epiphanes, who did not die in battle, as I mentioned. He died from an infestation of worms, a fitting end for someone like that if you read the details of it. It's the 4 generals who are described in detail in chapter 11 of Daniel. Ptolemy the First, and there's a bunch of these because they pass these down to their children typically. Ptolemy the First was the king of the south in chapter 8. The daughter that's mentioned there was Berenice, actually his granddaughter, as her father was Ptolemy II. And this gets into family tree confusion here, but it can be followed. Who was given in marriage to Antiochus II in a doomed plan to achieve political gains by intrigue and deception, and it's really a very detailed description there. After various raids and generals, as I read through yesterday real quickly, the king of the south was Ptolemy IV, and then Ptolemy V, because this spanned quite a bit of time. The king of the north was Antiochus III, who, as prophesied, was utterly defeated in 217 BC. So he died in battle. The details fit historical record, as with the Ptolemies, right up to the contemptible person Antiochus Epiphanes. It is he who is believed to have engineered the murder of a prince of the covenant, Daniel called him, who turned out to be Onias III, the high priest. The first chapter of the apocryphal book, First Maccabees, details his plundering of the temple and other acts of savagery. So we learn more about Antiochus from the Apocrypha. So they do have some value. Whether or not they're inspired by God is the question that kept them out of any official lists of the canon. But they were held on to nonetheless, and they were part of the Septuagint, which was made about that time. So anyway, you can go read that, more details about that in First Maccabees. Though they were fulfilled in the past, we can't dogmatically state that no future fulfillments remain, but neither can we presume that these alliances and military campaigns will be repeated. In all the details of the remaining prophecies in Revelation, there's no mention of the kings of the north and south and details that would connect them to future events. So though a future fulfillment is possible, it seems unlikely. Now, I've mentioned before, I believe that the United States especially, and the Western world in general, is going to be the kingdom of the beast, because the other 3 directions have been taken care of. Now, when I say this statement here about future fulfillment being unlikely, does that still hold true that this must be the Western world? And I think it does for other reasons, and that the West is just simply conspicuous by its absence in all of that discussion in Daniel, and that this is the only place left, really, because at least in Revelation we have the north and east mentioned, and so the only possible unknown would have been the south, which is largely Africa, northern Africa, and the likelihood of the West not being the kingdom of the beast is pretty small, in my opinion, in comparison. So I think it still stands that the Western world is the kingdom of the beast. I don't think anybody would argue with that by its character now, and the fact that it's got so much occult symbolism all over the place built into it, especially in Washington, D.C., which is, as I mentioned yesterday, one of the 3 city-states in the world today. The other 2 being the Corporation of London, the City of London within, or the corporation is within the city, is a separate entity, just like Washington, D.C. is a separate entity, and also the Vatican is a separate entity. They are city-states. And Babylon, ancient Babylon, was a city-state, and I've gone into all that before. But in verse 36 of the same chapter, Daniel will read of the king who exalts himself. And I think we're in chapter 11 by this time. Who has no regard for the gods of his fathers or the desire of women, which is not saying he's a homosexual. It's just saying that he has no regard for anybody's gods, not even the gods that women honored, that typically were those who protected them in childbirth, so they believed. And instead, he will honor a god of fortresses, or you could possibly say forces, but it's mostly a god of military encampments, or so to speak. And we might still tie him in with the preceding discussion of Antiochus Epiphanes and the kings of the north and south, but these new details have no historical precedent. And they're tied in with chapter 12, which begins at that time and includes the resurrection of the dead. So we have good reasons to take this king who exalts himself in verse 36 as yet future. Okay, he has too many differences and things that have not been fulfilled yet to have been fulfilled in the past. So we have that to look forward to. Then this is the Antichrist, the beast. So although Antiochus Epiphanes, a couple hundred years before Christ, was a very clear type or foreshadow of the ultimate future fulfillment in the Antichrist, which is a popular name for the beast in Revelation, early in chapter 12 is where we see the phrase Jesus used, a time of distress such has not happened from the beginning of nations until then, which is yet future. So it hasn't happened. And there has been much terrible suffering in the world since 70 AD, such that the fall of Jerusalem at that time cannot have been the ultimate fulfillment of the prophecy, because terrible times have come and gone many times over. And so we have this future fulfillment to wait for yet, where Jesus called it a time of distress never seen before, never to be seen again. And hi, once again, to more people in the chat, thanks for coming. See you, Agave. Sorry, you got to go to work. Anyway, this will be recorded. So these are still future. But because of this overlap and duality, teachers of Bible prophecy must exercise restraint and caution in looking for modern fulfillment. So we got to look at every detail. So all we can say for sure is that the ones who have no match in history will happen, and they will happen literally, because here again, if they're not literal, we run into a lot of inconsistencies and cherry picking on which is literal and which is not, and then you eventually paint yourself into the corner of, did Jesus literally rise from the dead? So for consistency's sake, I think the literal method that I use is probably the most likely to be accurate. So I'm looking forward to these things literally to happen. Now, when we looked at Daniel yesterday, we also realized that not everything was sequential, because we looked at the names of the kings' reign in which the vision was given, and we know the sequence was in Babylon was Nebuchadnezzar and then his son Belshazzar, and then the kingdom was given over to the Medes and Persians, Darius and Cyrus, and so forth. And Daniel will jump back and forth and tell you which year of the reign of the particular king he was given the vision in. So we have to watch those details to know when Daniel is going back over something to give more detail. And chapter 7 is one of those instances about the dream of the four beasts, and then the interpretation, which focused on the fourth beast, as we saw yesterday. And we talked about the 10 horns, one replaced by another horn, and that this beast will overcome the righteous for 3.5 years. And we'll look at a chart, we'll go over that again and see it more in a pictorial way than just verbal. But the description of that fourth beast exactly matches the one in Revelation, and there's the references. And since none of this describes the situation of 70 AD, it must be yet future. And you can get more about the historical events here in this link. And let me go back to where I was. Now we have a good grasp of all that was prophesied through Daniel. We can focus on the 70 weeks prophecy of chapter 9, since it lays out a clear sequence for all remaining prophecies about Israel. The first 69 of those weeks were marked as completed when Jesus came, and that's what this other footnote was about, that it was divided up, as we saw yesterday, into 7, then 62, then 1. So that makes 70. The 7 and the 62, this is the sequence and the time, and because we know the time in hindsight, because we know when the Messiah came and was cut off. So the first 7 of the 70 weeks of years was between the time of the restoration of Jerusalem, the order was given, and the time it took to fulfill it. And we can see Ezra and Nehemiah, those little known Old Testament books, for details and the conditions in which it took place. And then after the 62, after that was when the Messiah came, and that was 434 years later after the seventh. So that's a total of 483 years. And there is some dispute over when exactly the decree was given to restore Jerusalem and when it was fulfilled. Some say it didn't happen till the Balfour Declaration, which I think is a really big stretch, because there's a lot of people who want to put everything in Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy in the end times. There are some that put it all in the first century. There's some that put it through history, and there's all sorts of different things people do that I think is based on missing some details. But of course they would say that the same about me, and what I won't do that they do to people who believe as I do, and not just me, but this approach. What I won't do is call them names or attribute their teachings to Satan, or say that they're stupid or deluded or they need to get to my level or anything like that. Those are arrogant, judgmental statements that I don't make. And I just am dismayed that other people make them just for a difference of opinion. Anyway, that's what some people believe. And I believe that the 69 of those 70 weeks were fulfilled by the time Jesus came, and completely fulfilled. And that the 70th week is set apart from the rest. And that's indicated in that section of Daniel 9. And that 70th week, which is 7 years, divided into two halves at the point where the 7-year treaty is broken, the abomination is committed. So when we see the same event in the New Testament, we know that it marks the midpoint, as I mentioned earlier, such that 3.5 years remain before the return of Jesus to the earth and the restoration of Israel and Jerusalem. So this is the biggest thing that ties Revelation and Daniel. And it's unmistakable. There's a 7-year treaty. It's broken halfway through. And when it's broken, an idol is set up to desecrate the temple. Jesus did not desecrate the temple. And a lot of other things did not happen. And especially, as I mentioned yesterday, Jesus said the new covenant was not instituted until his blood was spilled. He said that at the Last Supper, that this, the cup represented his blood of the new covenant. And he was basically signing this treaty in his blood, but it wasn't a 7-year treaty. It was a forever treaty. So nothing matches preterism's interpretation of Jesus' ministry as fulfilling it, which they hold must be 3.5 years in order to make it. And I don't see a half year in there anyway, whether it's 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. There's a range of time that's possible, but I think it was a 2-year ministry. And certainly not a half year, because Jesus' ministry began very close to a Passover and it ended at a Passover. So there's no room for a 6-month, half-year fulfillment. So for a bazillion reasons, I believe that Jesus was not the prince that shall come that violated the treaty and set up an abomination. He didn't do anything such thing. And yes, good mention of Hebrews in the chat there, about the fact that Jesus had to die to enact the promise that was made to Abraham so long ago. And also Hebrews 7 is where it says, when there is a change of priesthood, there must be a change of law. The two are inseparable. And the priesthood of Melchizedek, which Jesus holds forever, is not mentioned anywhere in the laws of Moses. It is not the same priesthood. Therefore, nothing to do with the laws of Moses can have anything to do with the priesthood of Melchizedek, which Jesus is our high priest. So this gets into the whole Hebrew roots thing, and I've gone over that before. Anyway, this is future prophecy that ties Daniel and Revelation, one of several, and there's other prophecies as well I might, if I have time, get into. And we must, as I mentioned yesterday, not overlook the stated purpose of the 70 weeks, to end and atone for sin, to begin eternal righteousness, to seal up prophecy, which is to say, finish it, and to anoint and dedicate the most holy place. But these things are all specified as applying to your people and your holy city, Daniel's people, the Jews, and his holy city, Jerusalem. It's a very specific, pointed, limited prophecy to them. It will involve the rest of the world at points, as it says there and elsewhere, but the prophecy is specified for those people. It's about the Jews, not the church, and that's the point, not the church. So this is a very clear and focused prophecy about Israel and Jerusalem, not the church. Certainly the judgment of the nations is included on other accounts, but this particular prophecy is very exclusive. So that's was my main analysis that I talked about yesterday. We tied it to the Gospels, what Jesus said. And I want to show you a chart first, and then I'll try to remember where I put another sequence that I did after that. So let me stop sharing this for a second and go and get this chart that I have. And I put a link to it in the description. It's a big chart. And you can see here, I know you can't read all those words. They're very tiny, but that's why you should go to that link and get the chart yourself. But it's a timeline that goes back to Babylon and rolls right into Revelation. This is why I'm showing this. This is by somebody named Charlie Campbell, and it's a PDF. It says updated June 2007, so that's 7 years ago. Anyway, it talks about Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the coming kingdoms, and it shows the Babylonian Empire and gives detail and talks about times of the Gentiles also going up to the time of the revived Roman Empire. You've heard that term before. The reason we call the revived Roman Empire, even though Scripture doesn't use those words, it also doesn't say Roman Empire. It doesn't say Grecian Empire. It does mention Medes and Persians and Babylonians, of course. Those were in the days of Daniel. He did not know the names of the future ones yet. And, as far as the names of the emperors or kings, and Rome was not mentioned at all. And yet we know that Rome was in power when Jesus came at the end of the 69 weeks. And I believe that this is why it will pick up where it left off in the first century. That it will be like the Roman Empire. And this is why people have said it's a revived Roman Empire. It won't be exactly the same, but it will be pretty much the same as far as the area and the lineage of people and the entities coming against Jerusalem. And this will be, as Daniel pointed out yesterday, we saw in Daniel yesterday, that God's kingdom will replace it at the end. And so Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome were the succession of empires that Daniel foresaw in that dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of the statue. Then Jesus came at the end of the 69 weeks, okay, and he was cut off as shown, and it was also described in Isaiah 7:14. You can see, if you get this chart, you'll see that there as well. Then Jesus was cut off, and then he rose from the dead, and about 40 years later, the temple in Jerusalem were destroyed as prophesied. Then we have this church age, and that's where it says, you are here near the end of this age. Israel was declared a nation after 1,878 years without a homeland. People will say, well, the Balfour Declaration was strictly the Rothschilds, which is true. And it was set up for reasons that had nothing to do with God. That is not true, because in time, look at Egypt in the past and the Exodus. You can look historically and secularly at all those events and say God had nothing to do with that, with setting up the Pharaoh, for example. But God predicts things, and that's the point. If he had caused them directly, then that's not much of a prediction, is it? He puts boundaries on human activities and makes sure that things that he predicts are going to happen. But the point is that he predicted it. And we have to also remember that predictions and fulfillments don't always happen in a day, even though there is a scripture that says, can a nation be born in a day? And it starts out saying, does a woman give birth the minute she has her first labor pain? And yet Jerusalem or Israel will be born in a day. And I'm butchering that passage, but the teaching is there that Israel would be born in a day. And that pretty much happened at the Balfour Declaration. God predicted it. Whether he uses good or bad people to do it is beside the point. The fact is that it's a prediction and a sign, okay? But nothing else happened right away. It even took till 1967 for them to get Jerusalem. And then Jerusalem is a bigger key to prophecy than just the whole nation of Judea or the area of Judea and the nation of Israel. Jerusalem is the biggest key, and the temple is even the more specific key within Jerusalem, but it has to be in Jerusalem. And so the Balfour Declaration is certainly a sign in itself. Israel is a sign. And yes, they're there in unbelief, as I said before. They have to be. Why else would God judge them and allow them to be plundered if they were there in faithfulness? So they have to be there in unbelief, which is exactly what they are and what that declaration produced. And God predicted it way back in the Old Testament times. So there will be another gathering that God himself does. Make no mistake about that. Okay. I just see something in the chat there. It's easy to see now because there's not much activity, but 70 years, this year's could be the years of Jacob's trouble. Anything's possible. And I talked about all the prophetic convergences yesterday. A lot of people do believe that the tribulation starts this month. I don't know. Like I said, signs precede things that happen, but who knows by how much? Could be a day, and it could be an hour. I don't know, but it will precede it. And I, as a pre-trib rapture believer, believe it could have happened any time because there are no signs preceding it. But the tribulation certainly has signs preceding it. And if we're seeing those signs, then the rapture must be even nearer. But how much nearer, nobody knows. Could be immediate, could be 10 years, I don't know. And there are some prophecy teachers who will say they're convinced that this time of year is when that will happen, but they don't know what year. And I'm thinking, looking at all these convergences, that the year, if this isn't the year, I'll be wondering how much more specific it has to be in the future. Anyway, back to this chart. We will be resurrected. This is promised in the scriptures, and we got to remember which scriptures apply to us, the church, and not to Israel. And the things that Paul does not mention when he talks about our gathering together with Jesus and our meeting him in the air, not on the ground, and gathering together to him and being snatched up, which is a passive event. We are not asked to board a ship or anything like that. Jesus will come and take his people. First, he'll take the dead who belong to him, and then he'll take whoever is left alive, who is still alive when he comes to do this. And there's scripture references for that. I've gone over the rapture before. I've gone over dispensationalism before. I've gone over the literal, historical, grammatical method of interpretation before, so I won't go into all that. This box up here is more about the scriptures about the rapture. And then we're up here in heaven for 7 years. This is also referenced as the marriage of the Lamb, which is Jesus to the bride, the church, Revelation 19:7. Because the bride and the bridegroom come from their chambers. Well, when does that happen in Jewish wedding customs? It happens after 7 days. They are betrothed, and then there's typically a year-long betrothal, and then during that year, the groom goes to his father's house and builds on an annex or an addition. And Jesus at the Last Supper said, I'm going to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house there are many mansions. Mansions is an old word. It doesn't mean mansions. It means rooms built on. And that's what children did. They built on rooms to their father's house. And that's what took the year. And then the groom would get his friends together, usually around midnight, and they would go with torches to light the way and start proclaiming with trumpets and shouts that they were on their way to collect the bride at her house, her parents' house. And along the way, they would gather more people who would celebrate with them, and they would arrive outside her house. They didn't go inside. She would come out to meet them outside of her house, and then they would all go back up to the father's house, and the couple would be in seclusion for 7 days, and then they would have the wedding supper, the banquet. This is such an illustration of why, another reason why I believe in the pre-trib rapture, because here we see the church in heaven for 7 years, that the bride and groom are together in seclusion for 7 years, and then they come down for this banquet. Okay? So many things fit. And 7 years being the time what we're given by Daniel. And we'll know the midpoint when that desecration of the temple happens. And there are things, as I've mentioned before, go look at my my social networking blog. Let me get the link again. I've been putting that in all of my videos lately. Let me get that link for you. And let me get one of the prophecy ones, because if I just get the main link, you'll be going, okay, where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Because I put a lot of new stuff in there too. And let me get the link for you about that. Well, there's several of them, of course, but there's a certain one I'm looking for that I want to get for you. And boy, I've posted a lot of things since then. Sorry about that. I will get you the link for that particular prophecy. Sorry about this. Got lots of other things in there. There we go. There's the main one I wanted. Here's the link. I will post in the chat. And you can see more about things that in the middle of Revelation that stretch forward and backward. That's what that mainly I wanted to get that for. And this chart does that. There's a chart on my wall behind me that you may have seen other times when I've had my camera on that points as well to these things in the middle here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. This second gray down pointing triangle that stretch back and also stretch forward. And this 3.5 years is the time of Jacob's trouble, the time that Jesus said had never happened before, would never happen again. And we've been over that stuff. And after that, then we have the second coming. And even the second coming could include the rapture, because not that they happen at the same time, but that things don't always happen all on the same moment in Bible prophecy. And that's the point. This chart has the seal judgments in the first half, the first 3.5 years, and the trumpets and bowls in the second half. I kind of disagree with that, but that's possible. I believe that the trumpet judgments are the first half, and that the seals are between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation. Because, you know, you have to unseal the document. And some people, there's two ways to take that document, that scroll that has 7 seals that the Lamb opens one by one. And each time he opens a seal, a judgment happens. And this is his wrath, and it is recognized by the 6th seal. But since the Lamb is opening the seals and bad things happen on earth, this is the Lamb's wrath, and we are not a part of that. So we're gone before that point, whether it's beginning the tribulation then or not. And the 7th trumpet is the midpoint where all these things happen, and look back at the 2 witnesses and all sorts of things. And that's why I think the trumpets comprise the first half of the tribulation. But no terrible big deal there. But the point is that Jesus comes after all the 3 sets of 7 judgments, the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. And I've been over those before. And this is the Great Tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble. At the end of that is the Battle of Armageddon. But it's actually a big letdown, as I mentioned before, because even though the armies gather to oppose Jesus of all things, and the armies of heaven, they come down, and people, as they're being prepped to do right now, will think of this as the bad Yahweh and try to fight him, which is about the stupidest thing people could do. But they're being primed for it right now, being told that Yahweh is the bad, bumbling demiurge creator that made this terrible place, and they're going to fight against him. This is what Gnosticism, Luciferianism are prepping people to be in a mindset to do, and why I've been screaming about it all this time. And people are taking any and every mishmash of religious ideas, like they're picking from a buffet that I mentioned about syncretism in an earlier video, and putting them together into what they believe is against scientism, which is ironically, as shown in a video by a Truth is Stranger in the Fiction called, I keep wanting to say Ethereum, but it's not ethereal or something like that. Excellent full-length documentary that explains the fact that what is being promoted by scientism as quantum physics is in actuality the same syncretistic New Age religions, which are really old, Hinduism, Gnosticism, all these isms from the past. In other words, people will think they're opposing these religions at the same time they're adapting them. It's a stroke of evil genius, but that's what I've been trying to warn against, to falling on deaf ears for the most part. But that's what people are being set up to do, to actually fight Jesus when he comes back. And then we have some judgments on earth, and the sheep and goat judgments and so forth, that I believe is that time. And we'll get into some other prophecies that are mentioned here as well. But anyway, after the tribulation, some things happen when Jesus gets here. He takes care of some business. Then there's 1,000 years of the direct reign of Christ on earth, 1,000 years of peace, and then the release of Satan and so forth. But The point here today is not to go over every detail, but to tie it to Daniel, and that's what I wanted to do. And these things will happen, it's guaranteed. So there is a lot to happen yet. There's a lot that has happened, some that's been completed, some that's been partially fulfilled, but not totally, and so remain, and some things that haven't happened yet at all. And the word in Revelation about coming quickly, this is the word tachos, from what we get the word tachometer. It measures speedily, not temporally, being soon. So when you see translations say, come soon, Jesus, it really should be translated, come quickly. So when these things happen, they will happen quickly. And that's the point, I think, of Revelation. Now let me take a minute and go and look for a document I had that I think did a more easier to see of some of the things that are going on as far as some of the other assorted prophecies. And I know I've gone over this before, but it doesn't hurt to go over it again. And let me see if I can find that real quick. Remaining Bible prophecies. This is at my What in the World site. Let me get you the link. And guys, there are some people who believe we're already in the tribulation. I think there's too many things that haven't happened that have to happen in sequence. But you might want to check out this document. It's a one-pager, but it's kind of long, and it has some convenient links here. We'll take you to each section. And this was my first attempt, along with, it's kind of in conjunction with the book I mentioned earlier. I had a link to in the description about the closer look at Daniel, the analysis. That's what that's from, is my book. But this is a one-pager, and we can see that in the background here that where I'm trying to integrate all the remaining prophecies from both testaments, and that there's a lot of things I could be wrong about, but it's the best I could come up with. And everybody should have a humble attitude when it comes to these things, because nobody's infallible, especially people outside the faith. There are some who believe they are infallible in interpreting the Bible for us, and that these things are not literal. And I think they're speaking not only very ignorantly, but also very arrogantly. Anyway, I've talked about the fulfillment of prophecies, and we have to understand how the separateness of Israel and the church, or will misinterpret a lot of things. There's footnotes here you can check. The church age ends by a specific number that we are not told, not by a specific date or sign. And I give reference to that, and the fact that there can be transitional periods, but the remaining prophecies are almost all about the Jews as a people and about the unbelieving world, not the church. So the end of the church age, skipping through some things here, is given a sequence again. And this sort of thing seems to happen in rapid succession. The Lord will descend from heaven, and I've given all the references here. The archangel will shout, arch meaning from archi in Greek, meaning chief or first or origin or original. There's a whole range of meanings for that word, but the chief angel, not the original angel, but the chief one, will shout. So Jesus descends from heaven, stops in the air, does not come to earth. The archangel shouts. There is a trumpet blast, which is the last trumpet, not the seventh trumpet. And I think I go into that more. And besides the fact that Revelation wasn't even given yet, Paul was long dead before John was given the revelation about seven trumpets. And those are trumpet judgments. And this is a trumpet calling people to go somewhere, which I give references for. There were two trumpets that would sound when Israel was roaming the desert. And they were, one was to break camp and the other was to actually move out. So that would be the last trump. There's a first and a last trump there. There's also the trumpets of the Feast of Trumpets, which has been going on all these centuries. And this is the month when the Feast of Trumpets is. It happens to be September. And that the last trump would be actually they blow more than one, because the Feast of Trumpets is the feast that no one knows the day or hour, because it depends on the new moon, which you can't always be certain about. So they would celebrate it on 2 consecutive days. And the last trumpet would be the one that is blown. They would blow a trumpet 100 times, 100 blasts, and then there would be a last one. And as I said, the last trumpet of Revelation is never called the last, but it happens to be the last of 7. And it is a judgment against the unbelieving world and against the Jews. It has nothing to do with the church. So this is why this last trump that Paul mentioned is not it in Revelation. Talking about a different last trump. At that time, so we have the Lord descending, the archangel shouts, the trumpet blows, the dead Christians will be raised in immortal bodies. The bodies of living Christians will be instantly transformed to immortal. That's what happens in, quote unquote, the twinkling of an eye. It's just that part, this transformation from mortal to immortal. Then all of us together as a group are snatched away into the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. We're not asked to board a ship. We're not asked any questions at all. Whoever belongs to Jesus will be taken, whether they like it or not, whether they believe it's going to happen or not, they will be taken. And they will be snatched. The word is harpazo, which is meaning to rob, and which is why the Vulgate translation by Jerome translated raptos, or a variation on that depending on the part of speech. And that is where we get the word raptor, velociraptor, speedy robber. You don't ask anybody if they'd like to be robbed. You just rob them. And that's what's going on with the Greek word harpazo. And it means we're going to be taken suddenly without warning into the air to meet the Lord in our immortal bodies. So only immortals can be in heaven, and that's what has to happen to the living and the dead who have been waiting for their bodies to be transformed. And Paul caps it all off by saying this is a message of comfort and hope. There is no mention of any disasters or world leaders or anything of Daniel. So there you have all the reasons, at least, the most concise form, why I believe the rapture is a very separate event from the second coming. There's too many things that are opposite, such as Jesus coming to get us rather than at his second coming when he brings us with him. So in 1 Thessalonians, one of the passages mentioned here, in 5:3, who are the they who say peace and safety? Because we've had numerous times when people will make a treaty involving Israel and talk about peace and safety, or the word is for safety can be taken as security. And then there is a sudden destruction. So whoever is they is not the you, which is the church. Paul is writing to the church. So it's not you, it's they, not the church. That's all we can say for sure. And the way we are not to be caught by surprise, because Paul makes a distinction, they will be caught off guard, but you won't. Or who are you? You're the church who are being watchful and ready at all times, which is what I've been saying every time I talk about prophecy of the rapture or dispensationalism. We are supposed to be busy doing the work we're given to do, not to just sit around and wait, but always be ready to go at all times. Okay? We don't know the exact date and hour, therefore we must keep watch. But even the statements that Jesus said about that before the cross were directed to Israel. They're supposed to keep watch as well, because the church wasn't even revealed yet. There's all the references to back up that statement. So what he said about watching and being ready, what Jesus said, as well as praying to escape, was for them and not the church. But of course, Christians of all times are to be eager to see Jesus return and to live lives that we will not be ashamed of when he does. This is taught throughout the letters. And that the idea of escape, this is what reason I cite this when people attack the rapture view, the pre-trib. Escaping is a good thing. Jesus is saying, pray to the Jews, pray that you will escape all these things. And he may be referring to the time when he says, run when you see the abomination, get out. And he's saying, pray that you may be found worthy to escape all these things. So at any rate, the point is that escaping and wanting to escape is a good thing. It's not a cowardly thing. Who in their right mind would want to sit and take the wrath of God? We have not seen the wrath of God. Ancient Egypt saw the wrath of God, but the church is not to see it. We've got numerous references for that. And the people of Israel will see it, but there will be exceptions. There's always a remnant, and the exceptions will be made for those who take heed to the warning about the abomination and get out of there. Okay? And Revelation speaks of it as a place in the desert prepared for them by God, where they will be protected and fed for a time, times, and half a time. We got into that statement yesterday. That means the final 3.5 years. So point being, as far as the rapture goes and things like that, is that escape as a concept is not a cowardly thing, okay? Because we are not to suffer the wrath of God. Sorry about that pop-up there. Then there are some transitional battles in the Old Testament, which is what I wanted to go over. The geography and ethnic groups cited in these passages are identifiable and have the motivation expected of the area before the tribulation. Okay? So these happens before the tribulation or as it's getting started, which means after the rapture. So that's why I called them transitional battles. Excuse me. We have, first of all, the destruction of Damascus in Isaiah 17. It has the air of suddenness about it, that people go to bed one night and wake up in the morning and it's just gone. It's already well ruined, but there's a finality to it that happens suddenly that is predicted in Isaiah 17. And that flocks will graze there to that point. We aren't quite there yet. There are people there. And it will happen when the glory of Israel has faded almost completely, and then the people turn back to God. Here again, we have a sequence, not necessarily how long this process takes. Then we also have Psalm 83, where there's the intent of the nations bordering Israel is to wipe it out. And the enemies of Israel band together to wipe it off the map and make it so that nobody remembers it. And these are listed with their ancient names. And these correspond roughly to modern-day Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, northern Iraq, and possibly parts of Egypt. In other words, the nations immediately surrounding. And in my prophecy book that I linked earlier, or that's in the description, has a maps section in the back that will show you that. And so this is Psalm 83's scope and motivation. Immediate neighbors of Israel, and they want to wipe Israel off the map, okay? And then we have a different incident, Gog, who is the title of the ruler, and Magog is the land. Okay, when you hear Gog and Magog, that's what's going on. And Gog is held by many students of the Bible to refer not only to a particular individual, but to the force behind it, the spirit behind it being Satan. Okay, so we have Gog of Magog being the leader of a group of nations that are in a wider area around the Mediterranean Sea. And they have a different motive. So this is an expanded, if you think of Israel, Israel as the epicenter, and then we have the immediate neighbors as a circle around that, and then a wider circle is what this Gog and Magog is involved with. These are all around the Mediterranean Sea, and their intent is different. They want to take a spoil, that is to loot, a nation recovered from war. That's Ezekiel 38:39. And the weapons in that passage are used as fuel for 7 years afterwards. And this contrasts between this battle and the one in Revelation 20, which also mentions Gog and Magog. But these armies are a different source. They're from all over the world, and the manner of their defeat is different. Okay? In end of Revelation, there's an earthquake. They attack each other. There's a plague. There's rain, hail, and sulfur. In the first one, and then later in Revelation is the fire from heaven comes down and consumes them. Magog was populated by the descendants of Japheth, who went to the area now known as Russia, the Caucasus Mountains, that area, though some people hold that these nations are all in Asia Minor. Again, look at the maps. And Meshech and Tubal refers to areas north and east of Magog. Persia is northern Iran. Cush and Put are northern Africa. Gomer settled along the Danube River. It's where we get Germany. In modern Eastern Europe and so forth. And Togarmah settled in Turkey. So we have all these nations listed. And we can trace the Table of Nations, so-called. If you look up Table of Nations, and there's differences with that, and I've gone over it before. And we see who these entities are in modern times. And so Russia is Gog and Magog is the ruler, Magog is the land, and he has all these other nations with him. And these are the nations in a wider area around the Mediterranean, mostly Eastern Europe. There's some in the Middle East and some in Northern Africa. And this is a coalition that will come for the purpose of looting a land that has recovered from war, which is Israel, what war did they recover from? Probably Psalm 83, where their immediate neighbors are defeated. So Israel suddenly has a lot more land, a lot more wealth, and Russia and its allies will not miss this opportunity to come and plunder it. Okay? This, I don't believe, involves the U.S. overtly yet, because I believe, as I said, the U.S. is the kingdom of the beast, and after the rapture, there will be a lot of transformation. I think we're already seeing some of the natural disasters, naturally caused or not. We're seeing all these, the fires, the unprecedented hurricanes, and all the powder kegs waiting to explode, such as the Yellowstone caldera, the San Andreas Fault, and the New Madrid Fault, which is being crossed like an X by the two eclipse runs 7 years apart. And so at the very least, those are unmistakable signs, along with all the other things going on this month. And but no, I don't believe that the U.S. is Magog. I believe that the U.S., at least as part of the Western world, will be the kingdom of the beast. We don't know whether for sure, we cannot rule out whether the church will witness any of this. We're seeing shadows of it already. But, this depends on whether I'm right or wrong about whether the seals are even begun to be open. I don't think we'll see any of the seals opened here on Earth. Whether any of these transitional battles happen before the seals is the question. That I don't know, but I kind of think none of this happens while we're here, because the church is not Israel, and God will not turn his attention away from the church until he turns it, or toward Israel until he turns it away from the church. Let's see, where was I? Before the enforcement of the treaty that marks the tribulation's beginning is marked by that 7-year treaty. So when that is signed involving Israel and many, that's when it actually begins, and we can confirm it in hindsight. People who are here on Earth will confirm it in hindsight when they see the abomination of desolation. So, yeah, I don't believe we'll be here to see the seals. The question is whether those transitional battles are part of the seals. I kind of think they are, but if they're not, we may see some of that. But here again, as the principle of the separateness of the church in Israel, I don't think we'll see those things, because that's all for Israel. So we don't know their duration and whether they're part of the treaty, but they are a sign nonetheless that we're seeing these things beginning to happen, and all the players are in peace, the pieces are on the chessboard, and so our departure or rapture is very near. So even the Apostle Paul in his day believed that the rapture, the departure, as he called it, the word was departure, apostasia, only means to depart, and was translated that way in all English translations before the King James. It means to depart, and you have to get what is being departed from the context, and the context is the day of the Lord, not false teachings. So Paul believed it could happen without warning in his own day, or otherwise he would have included these events in his sequential list that he gave to the Thessalonians. He didn't mention any of that. The second letter to the Thessalonians was written to counter a forgery that claimed the day of the Lord had already arrived. And you can see that in 2 Thessalonians 2. So somebody had faked a letter trying to put the people in turmoil, thinking they had missed the departure and they were going to have to go through the wrath of God. That's why they were upset. People aren't upset about things that they already knew were going to happen, that they were told they would go through, and people wouldn't be upset about something good that was going to happen. They were upset because something bad had happened, something that shocks them. And Paul wrote the second letter to clear up the mistake and to explain the fact that he always signs his letters. And this is why, incidentally, I don't believe Hebrew was written by Paul, because the book of Hebrews does not have a signature. And anyway, I'm saying all that to make the point that Christians should always be doing the work of the Lord, but always be ready to go at any time. And when we see all these convergences, we better wake up. Then Jesus makes some public statements I mentioned briefly before. And that, just looking at the chat for a second, Jews believe that Jesus came maybe, but they don't believe he was the Messiah because they think he didn't fulfill the prophecies. But anyway, back to Jesus' public statement about the end times. They were, as I mentioned before, they were talking about how great the temple was, and he said it would be destroyed. And this is something he said publicly while they were still on the temple grounds. There's a reference in Matthew 24:1. And this part was that he said publicly was fulfilled by Titus in 70 AD. Everything else was said privately at a later time to his inner circle of disciples. And it's possible, I speculate from that the prophecy about the people of Judea fleeing when they would see Jerusalem surrounded by encampments was partially fulfilled at that time in 70 AD, though, as I mentioned, it was only the Christians who escaped, and Titus did not set up an idol. Then his private discourse, which is commonly called the Olivet Discourse to Peter, James, John, and Andrew, very inner circle, the top of the 12. And this is what he told them only. He did not tell the general public. And this can account for some of the differences in the gospel accounts as to what was included in what Jesus said. And they asked 3 questions. They said, when will these things happen? About the destruction of the temple and so forth. What is the sign of your arrival? And what is the sign of the end of the age? They asked him these 3 things. And he gives some general signs which I think overlap some other things. And I don't remember if this is the one where I overlap with the... yeah, I'll do that in a second. Let me not get ahead of myself. He talks about things that indicate the kingdom of God is near. Okay? When you see all these things, the kingdom is near. And he lists false Christs and prophets. We've had plenty of those throughout the intervening time since 70 AD. Wars near and far, or rumors of wars, or insurrections, however you want to take that statement. Famines, earthquakes, lawlessness, cold-bloodedness, the gospel being proclaimed worldwide. We can hardly think otherwise in this age of the internet. Yes, there are people, isolated tribes that maybe haven't heard it. People today are largely ignorant about a lot of things, but it has been spread out. Whether everybody, pays attention or not is beside the point. Jerusalem surrounded, the abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, that is the time of Jacob's trouble, the darkened sun and moon, the stars fall from heaven to the earth, the sign of the Son of Man coming in the clouds, trumpet blast for angels to gather the chosen people from all over the heavens. So this is a general kind of overview that Jesus gives in these 3 passages, and he's giving them to the Jews. And this is one of the reasons why I don't believe that the Matthew 24 discourse, the Olivet Discourse, has to do with the church. So when people use that, pre-tribbers mistakenly sometimes use that to refer to taken and left, and I explain in my commentary and my translation what's going on with that. And there are similarities and differences in a couple of accounts where Jesus talks about that, 2 different situations. Jesus, in that situation in Olivet Discourse, talking to the Jews, says this generation will not pass before it all takes place. Debate rages over the meaning, but it will include the appearance of all these things, meaning the signs Jesus just given, which haven't happened yet. So this generation cannot be referring to the one immediate generation of Jesus' day. So then the question is, does it mean the whole generation of that time, or to the lifespan of people born then? There's been there's good arguments on both sides. Even if it is the latter, then we cannot say with certainty what the length of that generation may be or exactly when the signs began to appear. So you can't set dates. It would be reasonable to take it to mean the day of the Lord will not span a generation. I think that would be more accurate. And we know from Daniel that it will last 7 years, and that's what I was saying about things happening quickly once they began to happen. So no one knows the day or the hour. Those are the references for the arrival of the kingdom of God. Okay? And he talks about how it will be sign-wise and event-wise instead of the day or the hour. He will say it'd be like the days of Noah, like the days of Lot. And what do those 2 have in common? They have impending judgment coming upon people who were defying God and who didn't know what was about to hit them, except for those who were paying attention to the warnings. And that's what they have in common. Now, there's a lot of speculation that the days of Noah and Lot also involve fallen angels and people monkeying with the human genome. That's entirely possible. And we talk about, we can go back into the Nephilim talks that other people have done more detail on. Now, here's the part about taken or left. Matthew 24, Luke 17. In context, this applies to when the people of Judea flee upon seeing the abomination of desolation. This context also includes the examples of Noah and Lot, where the righteous were taken and the wicked left to suffer judgment. Okay? That's what happened in Noah and Lot. It was the righteous who were taken out, and the unrighteous were left to be judged. So Jesus said, so whichever way you want to take that, Jesus said, watch, pay attention to what's going on around you, pray to escape, and this will happen when least expected. There are two possible ways for not expecting something to happen. One is presuming it won't come in our day. That's one way not to expect it, as a lot of people are. And two, losing hope. That is to say, you've given up hoping that Jesus will come. So while the Jews do still believe that Jesus will come, or not Jesus specifically, but their Messiah, they're expecting him to come much later, and they don't know that he already came once before. The 10 virgins analogy that Jesus gave in Matthew 25 is not for the church, but for Israel. Okay? Keep in mind that in any illustration that Paul gave, and that Jesus gave at the Last Supper just before the church age would begin, was that the church is his bride. The bride is not a bridesmaid. The bride would already be in the building, and the bridesmaid are waiting outside for the groom to come. So this cannot be talking about the church. We are not the 10 virgins and 5 are foolish and weren't expecting him. That's not about the church. That's about the Jews not knowing the day of their visitation, whether then in Jesus' day or the days to come. So about exclusion from the kingdom, you can read more in Matthew 8. And then he gives his illustration in that Olivet Discourse about good and bad servants. Bad servants are those who beat their fellow servants because they're not watching for their master's return. He's delayed. There's been this long delay since 70 AD. So the servants can get lazy and sit there and beat each other or try to lord over each other or not do what they're supposed to do. They're being lazy. They're shirking their duties. And that's the point of this. All that Jesus has been saying to everybody, watch and do what you're supposed to do while I'm gone, so that when I come back unexpectedly, unannounced, I won't catch you either beating your fellow servants or shirking your duties. That's what the whole point of that discourse is. Then Jesus talks about the beginning of birth pangs, which I believe at least mostly overlaps the seal judgments. Okay? And there in these lists, this bullet point list, I give both references, some to Matthew, some to Mark, Luke, and Revelation, and I line them up by their events. So that's why I have, there's some of the seal judgments here, some of them here, but then this goes into the trumpet judgments. So we have false Christ, wars and uprisings, famines, plagues, earthquakes, and then the black sun, red moon, the stars fall, and the sky recoils like a rolled up scroll. This is the beginning of birth pains for Jesus' terminology, and the seal judgments per his terminology when he gives a revelation to John at a much later time. So I believe Jesus in his beginning of birth pains is talking about the seal judgments. Okay? So this is another reason why I believe we were not going to be here for the seal judgments. And that here again, those transitional battles and things may or may not be part of the seals, but I think they are because they concern Israel and not the church. Then he talks about the tribulation, which is a couple of the last seals and then into the trumpet judgments. A treaty is enforced for 7 years. I believe that may be at the moment of silence between, in the seal judgments, if you look at that moment of silence, that is not true between the trumpets and bowls. It's only between the seals and trumpets. I think that's when the treaty is signed, and this is also the time when the 144,000 Jews, 12,000 from each tribe, are sealed. So we have that enforcement of the treaty that starts the beginning of the tribulation. We have the beast, or the prince that deceives the world. We have the persecution, false prophets, strife and cold-bloodedness, endurance for salvation. That applies to that time, not to the church. And about the gospel of kingdom being preached then. Not the gospel of Jesus rising from the dead necessarily, but the gospel of the kingdom. That's the one the Jews knew about, and the one Jesus preached before he had even died, so that there could be a gospel of the resurrection of Jesus. So the gospel of the kingdom is a specific term, and that will be spread during the tribulation. There will be numerous people saved which is not part of the church, but made, turning to God and serving him, and they will be winding up in heaven, those people, those elect people, the saints. And then we get into the Great Tribulation that Jesus talked about, which I believe are the trumpet and bowl judgments. So we have the last of the trumpet judgments, and then we get into the bowls mostly. So there's this like the last judgment overlap between each of these groups. And we have the abomination of desolation that marks the midpoint, the seventh trumpet, or between the seventh trumpet and the bowls. It's hard to tell from the text. And then the bowl judgments begins, and there's the references in both testaments. Then we have a whole bunch of detail we can put together about this ruler who commits the abomination, called the son of perdition, the man of lawlessness, the beast. The name Antichrist in 1 John 2:18 is actually better applied to the false prophet or second beast, in my opinion. Miracles will be performed. This person claims to be above all gods and sets himself in the temple of God, has no regard for the gods of his ancestors, the one figured by women, honors a god of fortresses and a foreign god, fights the kings of the north and south, invades many nations, takes great plunder. Alarming reports from the east and north, so there's three of those directions, north, south, and east, will cause him to destroy many more nations in a great rage. Then he will make his camp near the Mediterranean Sea and the Holy Mountain, but he will meet his end there and will be defeated by the breath from the Lord Jesus. And this is tying back into future, this is tying from between Daniel and New Testament. So this is how we identify the beast / Antichrist, whatever you want to call him, the world ruler to come. At that time, the Judeans must flee to the mountains for 12,060 days. This is the time of Jacob's trouble. And then there's a battle outside of Jerusalem, which is not the Battle of Armageddon. Jerusalem is plundered, and that's in Zechariah 14. Then there's this unprecedented suffering that Jesus mentioned and Daniel mentioned. There will be false Christs and prophets during that time as well. And at the end of it, they gather in the valley of Megiddo, which is the Battle of Armageddon, though no battle actually happens, and that's described in those references. Then after the tribulation, in Matthew and Mark, we have these cosmic disasters. The sun and moon go dark, the stars fall from the sky, the powers of heaven are shaken, the sky is rolled up like a scroll. That's where people are afraid of the roaring and turbulence of the sea. Every mountain and island will be shifted from its place. Then we see the people who are here will see the sign of the Son of Man in the sky. What it is not described, but they'll know it when they see it. The Son of Man, Jesus, descends from the sky in the clouds. The Lord's army arrives. The bride and bridegroom leave their chambers. We are not the army. The angels are the armies of heaven. They always have been, always will be. They are the armies of heaven, the servants, and they will be not the bride and bridegroom who leave our chambers at that time. Jesus is the bridegroom. The church is the bride. So not even the righteous of all ages are coming at this time. We leave our chambers and the Lord's army arrives. And the Lord stands on the Mount of Olives, splits it in two, and there's a wide difference between the split. It isn't just a crack, it's a valley between them forms. And he fights against all the nations. And that's described in Zechariah 14. The beast is defeated, and then that's where Jesus said, where the body is, the vultures gather. The beast and the false prophet are thrown alive into the lake of fire. Satan is imprisoned in the abyss for the 1,000 years. Then there's a trumpet blast, a different one, where the angels harvest the elect from all over the world. These are the people who survived the tribulation. That's at the time we see the sheep and goat judgments. This is described very clearly in these passages where Jesus talks about the time when he comes down on earth and sets up his earthly kingdom. So that's when we know when this judgment takes place, and I've gone over that before. And then we have the 1,000 years. Israel is restored, reestablished in the land. They have the Jerusalem and a temple and a different priesthood, the priesthood of Zadok. And Christ, and who else does he have ruling with him? The souls of those who refuse to worship the beast or take its mark. So this is a subset of those who were killed during the tribulation that rule. They had to have been those who died during the second half of the tribulation by beheading for the crime of not taking the mark of the beast. This is a very specific group of people. Not everybody, not the church. Okay? So there's not the church there, and there's not the people who died in the first half of the tribulation and went to heaven because they were righteous and they were martyrs, and those people are described in Revelation. Not those people. So these are people who lived during the reign of the beast and the time the mark of the beast was given, and they refused to take it, and so they were beheaded. Those people rule on earth with Jesus for 1,000 years. Their rule is limited. This is not our rule as the church. We rule forever. They rule for 1,000 years. After the millennium, Satan is released for a short time. Then we have a final Gog-Magog battle with the different nations and the different motivation. This army is destroyed by fire before it even begins. Satan is thrown into the lake of fire, so Satan is a personal entity. There is a new heavens and a new earth without any sea, and a new Jerusalem. And that's the overview. And then I have appendices about the difference between the earth and the church and Israel, with footnotes to document. Then we have that closer look at the book of Daniel that I mentioned and went over in the book. And then we have fads and misconceptions about who is the beast, whether it's a Muslim or not, what the mark of the beast is, what it isn't, who it's given to, who the two witnesses are, a little bit about blood moons, tetrads, and Shemitah years, what we've heard about, who is Mystery Babylon, and who that isn't, and there's detail there. And then these 3 prophetic cities and details about those similarities and differences. And then I talk about that. So, and that also is from the prophecy book. And I don't want to belabor those points because this was, again, mostly analysis of Daniel, and I wanted to include the fact that Daniel matches Revelation. And so I think I pretty much accomplished that. And I don't know what else I would need to say. Man, I've been scrolling along and forgot to share this page. I'm awfully sorry about that, but I did give the link. Let me get that for you. I've been scrolling along and showing you things that you weren't seeing because I forgot to present. Old age or something, I don't know, or multitasking. But this was the page I've been looking at, the link I gave earlier. And I was scrolling over these, showing you the links and reading all this stuff. And I hope I described it well because I thought I was showing you all these things in the bulleted points. That's what I was referring to. I'm just going to roll over this real quick now. So there's a lot of material here that keep you busy for a while, but this is where I'm coming from. And as you can see, I did this back a couple of years ago. So we've gone a couple years down the road since then, and I don't think anything has been violated that I thought might happen because I'm not a date setter. I'm a sequence watcher and a sign watcher. And this is what we're commanded to do, and we have to do our due diligence and study. But I'm really sorry I didn't have that scrolling. I thought I did, and I wasn't looking at the watch page and paying attention to the fact that my panel here didn't have what I thought I was showing. So if you just got here, sorry about that, but I was just wrapping up. Yeah, I really sorry about that. I didn't show what I thought I was showing. But yesterday I went over Daniel, reading the book and doing some commentary as I went along. Today I tied Daniel to the Gospels that Jesus talked about the end times and Revelation and some other passages in the Old Testament and the New. And I think I pretty well wrapped that up. I've done so much prophecy material that I don't know a point of going over it more. But I've given you lots of source material, too, that you can link. There's some in the description, some in the chat here, so you might want to roll up and get those. But you can always just go to my sites and find them again. But so there you are, and I don't know what else to say. I'm going to stop presenting that, and just keep your eyes open, keep your head up, keep doing what you're supposed to be doing while you watch and wait and spread the gospel and all that sort of thing. So thanks for coming. We actually made it into double digits, not very far, but that's pretty good for me. And if you have any ideas what you want to talk about another time, let me know. Yeah, more people just arriving. Did any of you get a notice? Because I gave it a 12-hour notice. It should have gone out yesterday at 10 p.m. That I was going to be doing this hangout. So I want to make sure people are getting their notifications. If you're not, there's nothing I can do about it. It's YouTube. It's Google. And they've been slack about that lately for a lot of people. But I'm just shutting down. Sorry. I don't know why. Make sure if you're subscribed that you have also clicked the little bell icon and that you know what kind of notification you signed up for. I don't know why it didn't notify, because I said, I clicked the box that said, well, what it does when I set up a hangout, it says, put this on your channel so many hours before. So apparently, you should get a notification if you're subscribed when I put up a new video, and it's supposed to notify you then, but I don't think that's working. All I can tell you to do is that I don't plan these things ahead very far anymore. I don't do them on a regular day and time. And like I said, check your notification settings, because it's supposed to tell you when I put something up on my channel, and I have it advertised on my channel so many hours before, if possible, if I know, at least an hour before I go live. That's as soon as I can put a notification up. And whether Google, YouTube is sending them or not, I don't know what to tell you. But I generally am going to be doing any hangouts I do in the mornings in the Eastern time zone, because that's when my house is quiet. So that's what that's all about. And we've already gone 2 hours again. I don't like to go too much farther than that. Yeah, there's a good way not to be frightened of what's coming, and that is to belong to Jesus. And there's other prepping people can do. You have to follow your individual conscience on that, but we have the peace of God, as you look in Philippians. So anyway, I don't know what to tell you about notifications. Yeah, I don't know. So, but if anyone doesn't know how to belong to Jesus and bear his name and have the Holy Spirit rather than just knowing about him, it's all over my channels and things, especially the Where Two and Three Gather series. I put it in every one of those descriptions. So you don't even have to watch the videos, just grab one of those and you'll see it in the description. And it's real simple. It's about accepting God's offer to adopt us as his children. And the way we accept it is by faith in the Jesus who rose from the dead, and put our trust in him, and understand that we are asking to be children of God and to have a relationship as his children. And we have to understand that that's what this offer is. So it's a matter of faith and trust and humility. You just humble yourself before God and say, I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm trusting him to save me, and I want to belong to him as his child. And then live like he matters. And like I said, that's all spelled out in the descriptions of all my Where Two or Three Gather series. And any of us Christians can help you with that. So I'm going to shut down and see you all around some other time. I don't know when.